Being a young prosecutor in Chicago, what do you all think that people often want to hear about the most when talking about my job? Okay, murders. I heard murders. Yes, people often want to hear about the fingerprinting process, the DNA evidence, the jury trials I do, and all the murder stories. I mean, come on, anyone in the audience, raise your hand right now if you've ever watched a Netflix TV series or listened to a podcast that had to do with serial killers or murder stories. Yeah. And for those of you in the back not raising your hand, it's a good thing you're not under oath right now, okay? However, what people often don't understand is that we are dealing with the lives of actual people. And that just like this, a person's life can be changed forever, for either better or worse. And often, the prosecutor is the agent of that change. For instance, I recently worked on a car theft case regarding 18-year-old, let's just call him Chris for now, which isn't his real name. Chris had been accused of stealing a car in which he was a passenger in and that his friend was driving. The license plate of the vehicle had come up as stolen, so the police took them both into custody. During Chris's first court date, his public defender approached me and asked if I could speak to Chris and his mother, to which I accepted. When I walked into the conference room, immediately Chris's mom stood up and she began to yell that Chris should have never gotten involved with this group of friends, that she had told him multiple times to stay away from them, and that she had greatly disciplined him for doing so. I looked at Chris for the first time, who was silent and looking down. And that's when I began to review Chris's file, and I noticed that he was 18 years old. So I asked Chris, are you looking forward to graduating high school? Chris mumbled, and he stated to me that he was doing poorly his senior year, failing 2 of his classes, in fact, and would unlikely be graduating high school. I asked Chris in that moment, what did you want to do with your future? What did you want to be when you grow up? And for the first time in the entire conversation, Chris's eyes lit up, and he excitedly said to me, I want to become a chef and open up my own restaurant one day. So I asked Chris, what type of restaurant did you want to open up? And he said to me, cooking fish. Immediately, his mom rolled her eyes so far back in her head, and she began to scream at Chris, boy, you're out here getting in all this type of trouble, and you're out here talking about cooking fish when you can't even make me a waffle without burning it? In regards to Chris's situation and his burnt waffles, I may have not been able to prove a car theft charge, but I may have been able to prove a lesser charge. However, the critical question for me in this moment was, what was the best decision for all the parties that were involved in this case? Well, I had already spoken to the car owner who had gotten his vehicle back, and with his support, I told Chris, if he passed his classes, gave me his report card, and let me become the first customer at his seafood restaurant, I would dismiss his case. Most people in our criminal justice system aren't afforded the same opportunities that Chris was on that day. With nearly 2 million people incarcerated at any given year, the United States has the highest incarceration rate of any country across the entire world. The US government spends nearly $80 billion each year on both public prisons and jails. What I had done for Chris in that moment, some people would have said, is offering him a second chance. Others would have said, I was being soft on crime. No. I'm going to have to disagree with that one. Had Chris been convicted of a crime, both his identity and life would have been changed forever. When people are convicted of crimes, they often need to report that when applying for housing, jobs, schools, student loans, and even business loans. just like the one Chris may need one day to open up his own seafood restaurant. Since becoming a prosecutor, I have learned firsthand that there are massive public misconceptions about what the role of a prosecutor is. Some people believe that the only thing that prosecutors care about is locking up as many people in prison as possible. I mean, after all, the US does represent 4% of the world's population, yet houses 20% of the world's prison population. While others believe that the only thing that prosecutors care about is letting all the criminals roam free on the streets without any accountability whatsoever. While others believe that we're considered to be last responders. However, it is much more nuanced than any of these perceptions. But one thing does remain true, that the prosecutor is arguably the most consequential player in the courtroom. That the prosecutor is able to effectuate real change in a person's life akin to the story of Chris. Prosecutors have many capabilities. We're able to decide what types of charges to bring, whether they're felonies or misdemeanors. We can decide how many charges to bring against a person, when to bring those charges against the person, and we can dismiss a case at almost any time. Prosecutors also lead in the plea deal negotiation process, which is actually how 95% of criminal cases are resolved each year. Finally, prosecutors are often referred to as, perhaps you've seen this in your Netflix shows or podcasts that you've watched, is the people or the state. And that's because we represent the whole community rather than just one client, as we are getting justice for victims of crimes. Another misconception that people often have about prosecutors is that we are trained and taught to think that every single case can only be resolved in two different ways: guilty or not guilty. Ultimately, this binary mindset of guilty versus not guilty stands in the way of serving true justice in our communities. By all means, I am not advocating for murderers and high-tier crime to be let go and rampant on the streets. But what I am saying is that we need to further equip prosecutors to walk away from this binary mindset of guilty versus not guilty, and further incentivize them to find alternative prosecution methods that will help rehabilitate defendants to prevent them from re-entering the criminal justice system, which is otherwise known as recidivism. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And based off that, why do we need to do this? Well, the U.S. Department of Justice recently conducted a report that found within 3 years of the release, every 2 of 3 individuals were rearrested. Of these 2 individuals, half of them were reincarcerated yet again. I want you to take a look at these volunteers on stage. Within 3 years of the release, 2 of them have been rearrested. This person gets to go home. Of these 2 individuals left, half of them get reincarcerated yet again. Now, you're probably looking at the final volunteer and you're thinking to yourselves, well, Wesam, come on. One person going to jail? That's not that big of a deal. Come on. I want you to imagine that each one of these volunteers and people on stage represented 100, 1,000, 10,000 individuals. Now you can see the true magnitude behind this statistic. Thank you. We need to work with both our state and federal legislatures to create real, accessible alternative prosecution programs that will help rehabilitate defendants to prevent them from re-entering the criminal justice system. And how can we do that? Well, let's think about it together, shall we? 1, we can create anger management programs. 2, mental health therapy. 3, provide job networking and mentorship. 4, drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. And finally, 5, focus more on homeless shelters. Thank you. While this model may not be able to work for all types of cases, such as a rapist or a child predator, this can work for other types of cases, such as retail thefts, prostitution, or drug or alcohol abuse types of cases. Thank you. Yeah. Now, you're probably all asking yourselves at this point, Wesam, will these alternatives actually work? Do you have proof, statistics, and data to back up what you're saying in this moment? Do you have proof right here, right now, that this can actually work? And the answer to all these questions is yes. Working at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutors in the nation and a national leader in alternative prosecution, I have seen the results firsthand. Since 1972, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has worked with specialty courts, like creating and working alongside local court systems, such as mental health court, prostitution court, veterans court, mental health, drug, alcohol, and so many more that have helped rehabilitate defendants to put their lives back on track. Since 2012 through 2022, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has seen 24,000 cases go through its diversion program with a graduation rate of 75%. Of these 75% of graduates, nearly 80% of them have not been rearrested. In terms of improving our criminal justice system, this is an Olympic gold medal. Just imagine, these were individuals who were struggling with mental health issues, dysfunctional relationships in their lives, and drug and alcohol abuse issues as well, and so much more. Personally, I was involved with a program called Triage, where I was able to make plea offer negotiations to defendants who were struggling with mental health issues. This program helped provide resources to these individuals that could provide the tools and resources for these individuals to combat these mental health issues. Ultimately, we have seen firsthand that walking away from this binary mindset of guilty versus not guilty is life-changing. Why do we need to lower this recidivism rate? Remember that $80 billion that I spoke about earlier? Just imagine if we were able to take a small chunk of that $80 billion that I talked about earlier, the $80 billion that is being used to hold and incarcerate and hold these people in these systems, just a small chunk of that, and reinvest that heavily into these criminal justice system. No, the criminal rehabilitation system that is heavily understaffed, heavily overworked, and heavily underpaid. Just imagine the amount of lives we could change for the better, just like the story of Chris's. You know, I never did tell you all what happened to Chris in the end. Chris graduated from high school. He does deserve that applause, because requiring 18-year-old Chris to learn from his mistakes rather than navigating the criminal justice system is not just good for Chris. It is good for his mother. It is good for his community. And honestly, it's good for all of us. You know, I may have not been able to have my salmon from Chris's seafood restaurant just yet, but I do know now that Chris has the opportunity to go pursue his dreams and to hopefully make his mother something tastier than another burnt waffle. To help people like Chris. This is why I became a prosecutor. Because the United States should not have 20% of the world's prison population, but should strive and focus on holding those who are a real threat accountable, rather than letting people like Chris just become another number. Thank you.